Well, hello everybody, and welcome again to another OpenShift Commons briefing. Today, we are going to hear from SNCC. They've just published their latest or their second annual State of Open Source Security report. And Liran Tal is here. He's one of the authors and the researchers behind this report. And we're going to let him run through the highlights of this for probably the first 20 minutes or so. And if you have questions, please ask them in the chat. And then afterwards, we're going to have some live Q&A, and myself and Brian Gracely will be asking some questions too, because there's lots of really good information here. So I'm going to let us get started. Liran, why don't you introduce yourself and take us through this wonderful report?
Awesome. Thank you, Diane, and Brian, for inviting us to talk a little bit about open source security. So indeed about me, just a small introduction. I'm a developer advocate at SNCC and a member of the Node Foundation Security Working Group, and have started actually building this security report a while ago, and happy to release it so that we can go and review through that. So I'll be trying to monitor the chat, so if you do have questions, I'll be happy to take that during the session as well. So I think we can get started, right, Dan? All right.
Yes.
I'll take that as a yes.
Absolutely. I muted myself, so go for it.
All right, awesome. All right, cool. So hopefully you've heard of that before, and if not, I'll go and just give you the small brief. Basically, we've gone through several sources of trying to figure out, what is the state of open source security really throughout the different levels. That means, how do developers, how do they take security? Is this something they care about? Is this something they want to own? And if it does, is it something they're doing anything about it? So that's like one level of it. And, another aspect where, maintainers as developers themselves, but they are actually maintaining software. So, how is their security posture? How do they take security into their processes and their workflows? And then we went into, not just people, which is one aspect of it. And I think the human aspect is important here, but also what are the actual stats that we're seeing, right? So for example, what are the vulnerabilities that are common in different ecosystems? What is the state of, security in general? Is it improving? Is it not improving? Are we seeing more vulnerabilities, as the years pass by, or less of them? And we also kind of try to, even in that specific perspective, kind of try to level that into, application vulnerabilities, system or library, operating system or library vulnerabilities, then dived in a little bit more into Docker, and, how things are doing there. And then in general, try to, give kind of a 360 perspective of it through the entire set of, the human aspect, the actual state, the data that we collected, and how does that fit into the entire open source lifecycle? So how do vulnerabilities get discovered? How do people find out about it? What do they do to find out about it earlier if they can? And when a vulnerability is then known, what do they do about it? So these reports kind of try to get into aspects of all of those and share more of that. And so just an introduction here to the report saying, what did we do to collect all of this data? So first of all, one of those things were, of course, a survey that we ran. Several hundreds of respondents, obviously developers, and some of them are maintainers, have been able to reply to that and, answer a lot of questions around, their open source security processes. If they're using Docker, in what way, and, how do they remediate or find vulnerabilities? So that's one aspect of that. It's the human side of it. Other sources that we have looked at are obviously public registries. So querying a lot of, a big query around, GitHub, around NPM, open registries and public registries that we can actually collect data on. And, one aspect of this is obviously we're talking about open source. So is open source really booming? Is it expanding? Is it not? Like, what's going on there? So all of this data kind of helped us shape, these statistics. And lastly, of course, we have researched, of course, the internal database that Snyk has of our users and people, remediating and finding vulnerabilities in their apps as users. So what level of users are actually finding them? How can they remediate it? In Docker images, what interesting stats that we found, which I think would be, very good highlight of this report as well. So a lot of internal data gathering as well. So all of that is put into this report, which I'll start by. This is kind of the TLDR thing. If you haven't read through the entire thing, we kind of try to give you a good grasp into what are the key highlights. So as we kind of dive into it at this point, so you can see from the top left, open source adoption. I think we are all feeling that open source is booming. It's very speedily accelerating. And you can see through the statistics, right? Like Maven had doubled the amount of new packages that was indexed in the last year. NPM is growing, in very big levels as well. All the numbers here are, 2 digits numbers. Just in terms of the download counts, right? Not even, new packages indexed, but just download counts. We're looking at, over 300 billion downloads for 2018, which is, an amazing number. And as we go through the adoption of open source, developers are using more open source software. In the applicative level of that, there is a nuance that I think that is not always, respected or given enough amount of consideration, and that is the indirect dependencies that you bring in with your project. So as developers, we're kind of, we're developing something. We ship it, to production or wherever that is. And at that point, it's just there. And what we're kind of seeing when we're developing it is, those, 100 or 1,000 lines of code of something. But in reality, we are, open source is amazing. It's awesome. But we are bringing and, we are relying on people's code as well. And, that means also there's a lot of risk and, unknown and uncertainties that we bring into our apps as we import and use these codes as well. So I think that the big statistics here that gave a good reflection of this exact data point is 78% of vulnerabilities that we found for users of Snyk, that's the data that we could have collected, is it's found on indirect dependencies, right? So it's not those direct dependencies that you use that you're using this and that framework. Actually, a lot of that is coming from those indirect dependencies, and how they are built inside your application tree is a good significant part of your open source security. So as we're seeing that trend, with open source adoption, going into just known vulnerabilities in the ecosystem, we're talking about 88% growth over 2 years. So I think in the first year it was something like 43%, for 2017, just growth in application vulnerabilities, and the year after something like 33%. So it's an ever increasing at the moment. What we're saying is number of vulnerabilities that we're finding, that we're discovering, and we could start to speculate. Why are we seeing more and more? Is it because we are actually actively finding that because maybe there's a good security awareness? So, there's a lot of eyes looking at it and trying to discover and surface all of those. Or whether, I think the other part of it is we're just literally writing a lot of code and using that a lot of code, kind of in a distributed manner throughout, the entire communities of each of those ecosystems and packages. So, obviously we are bound to make use of and then find all of those vulnerabilities. And there's a good stat that I'll get to, I think, in the end about, when a vulnerability was introduced in the code until the time it takes it, to get found out. And, that's the median number of that is over 2 years, which is, we can talk about that just by itself for a while. So, known vulnerabilities in application libraries, in system libraries, or, what you find in operating systems, we find that has grown as well. over 4 times around, vulnerabilities that we found in Red Hat, Enterprise Linux, in Debian, and Ubuntu. All of those numbers are from like public official CVE details that you can find as well. And lastly, kind of trying to connect OS libraries vulnerabilities. Those exist usually in those Docker containers that we make use of very often. So as we are making more and more use of Docker containers to just ship our apps in a repeatable way, in a scalable way, etc. One of those things is while you're shipping something, you're containerizing it. It's it's this box that you're sending out, but maybe that box, besides your application data or your application vulnerabilities, if you have or not, it also includes maybe a layer of vulnerabilities that exist in the image itself. So I think previously to joining Snyk, I was an R&D team leader. So for me it was a very I think insightful thing to find out, because I also managed a team which we were owning the DevOps kind of perspective of that. We were more like an empowered DevOps developers. So trying to say we had our own Docker file, and we managed that and we maintained that. And I think the larger DevOps team was kind of figuring out the more critical things of how should that maybe scale, where should that get deployed, etc. But at the end of the day, we had the ownership of having that Docker file from node 8 or something like that. And that decision, which wasn't always was driven from what's good, rather what's common practice, or what's just the default, was just that it wasn't a very insightful decision that we made. And for me, finding out that you're pulling out maybe the node for the Node.js, the node default image, just to base your Docker file on, just shipped with 500 something vulnerabilities through system libraries and stuff like that. That's a very scary thought. And whether all of them really pose a high security risk to exploit, and get into I don't know, remote command execution or anything else, that you could think of as critical. So whether that's the case or not, that's still a scary number, and you don't want to ship anything that has vulnerabilities, to begin with, regardless of their priorities or severities or exploitation or not. It's just something that you would want to keep on a high, very very monitored thing to not make sure you're not doing. So I'm going to go to the chat and see if there's any questions so far. Nothing yet, so I'm going to go and continue drilling a bit more into the report. So one thing that we find out about, we asked developers, and this is a very, I relate to this a lot, but also I think that all of us as developers kind of can relate to this problem, which is, if you think about the word DevSecOps, it's kind of trying to get DevOps and then security and then everything, and then shifting everything of that to the left, right? You want to get the security handled really, in a repetitive way in your CI, very early in the process, not at the end, not doing pen test, after you release, 1 year later, etc. So shifting everything to the left is kind of something that we have to do, right? There is no choice, but evolving to doing that and doing that right. And scalable and well, and in a process that is very, akin to the developers' workflows. So while keeping that thought that this is a very important thing, what we've seen is, 37 of open source developers don't implement any sort of security testing during CI. So that's a stat that just think about it for a second, and then when you're talking about maybe just scanning your image for just vulnerabilities if it has inside it, which is what we just talked about. 54% of those developers who said they are using Docker containers to that end, I guess. So 54% of them don't do any of that image security testing, which is when we talk, I think about a little bit about DevSecOps, that's kind of DevSecOps in a nutshell, right? Or even, to phrase it differently, kind of like just scraping the surface of DevSecOps. How we shift left security testing for developers, both for containers and things that are more infrastructure level, that generally developers maybe wouldn't touch, but also for application level security testing. And this is, I think, comes as a surprise when we ask them, well, as developers, can you tell me, who do you feel is responsible for security, for your open source security, right? For the libraries that you use, the applicative libraries, and the frameworks that you use. So 81% of these users gave us, this notion of, I feel responsible for it as a developer. I think I should own the security of my application. And the same feeling was when we asked those users who were running those developers who were running Docker containers maybe in whatever ecosystem they tried it on, was just the same, right? 68% of users felt or developers felt or believed that they should own the security of their Docker images. And those developers would probably they're not sysadmins, they're not DevOps, they're not SREs, they're not anything I think that would give them the expertise maybe to do that. Maybe some are, but I think generally speaking, most developers are just developers. But even though they don't have that expertise specifically, maybe they still feel very a good sense of ownership around this, and I think it's good, right? It's a good trend, and I love seeing it. And I think what we should do is bridge that gap, because this gap of users or developers feeling they should own security, yet only 37 of them, 37% of them actually do security testing. So there's like a good notion of developers should own security, yet they're not really skilled or don't have the exact tools or processes on how to make that really work. But they have good intents. They do want to make that happen. So I'm taking the positive side out of that. Brian, what do you think? Do you wanna drill a little bit more into it?
Yeah, no, there's a tremendous amount of information in here. Congratulations to the team on sort of pulling it all together. Yeah, there was a few things that I kind of jumped out at me, and again, I don't have nearly the depth of security background that your team does, but looking at this, just the sort of starting off with known vulnerabilities in Docker images, 44%. There was a couple of things that were interesting to me. So, essentially, you said 44% of images scanned had a more secure base image tag to which they could have upgraded. What does that mean? Does that mean sort of the base OS that they chose to use had some issues and they could have chosen something more secure alternatively, or kind of how might somebody understand that?
Great. So I'm gonna probably scrolled a little bit too fast for that, so we missed it. But there we go. Right. So I'm really happy you asked that, because what I feel is that you touched a really sensitive point, because that one is like easy wins that people can gain, right? From even not having any kind of knowledge in security, just having this exact insight. So just to kind of baseline of what we did. So we scanned into, going into Docker Hub, what are the popular images that, people download in general. Took the top 10 of those, that made sense, because there's like a hello world example for Docker, which is apparently like 10 million downloads or something like that. So just filtering for the really related part of it, and whether that was a service, a database, or an actual runtime like a Node or Java app, Docker image. We just scanned them, and found those, at least 30 vulnerabilities inside them, using the default Docker image, right? Like the node dot colon latest or something like that, which teams may, default to do. And the thing is, going back to that sensitive point, is out of all of those images that Snyk customers, because that's what we had to base our data on, is out of all of those images that they scan, 44% of them could have just, upgraded or moved to a different image, an image tag that would have get them from 100 maybe vulnerabilities to 90 to 60 to 70, depending on what they chose. So just by maybe you want to move from a node 10 to node 10.4 or maybe node 11 or something like that. Just moving that base image tag to something newer would maybe reduce some vulnerabilities that come in the image itself. And drilling a little bit more into that specific very I think stat is we found out that 20% of those images can fix vulnerabilities if you just rebuild it, because when you rebuild it, usually you get updated packages, and if you're working with Alpine, this is something that Alpine is kind of pushing a lot in terms of they always try to get to give you an updated image. So instead of trying to remediate how specific vendors maybe have their own advisories and then they have their own patched versions of libraries. So Alpine would just maybe go and just release a new image with an updated version of that library. So generally speaking, just the idea of rebuilding something is going to fix vulnerabilities is by itself. We don't even have to move to anything else, because moving images is also like we're talking about it as if it maybe have been easy, but it also needs to be a very conscious choice, right? Because if you're moving from an image, they say that you're based on a Red Hat CentOS image for your transcoding app, and you're counting on the fact that you'll have some kind of an image magic library or something like that to do your video processing. So if I would tell you, go ahead and move to Slim or I don't know, CentOS slimmed version or something like that, maybe you would lose, that exact library that you just needed or some binary that was there that you were counting on. So it needs to be a conscious decision, right, of doing that. And I think that also if you have good CI and, good testing in general around it, you can try doing that, right? Try swapping those images to something that makes a lot more sense to you in terms of, reducing vulnerabilities. And, test your app, see that everything, kind of plays well together. So you can, doing, good security practices and good testing practices and generally good development practices would go a long way into this DevSecOps thing that needs to get maintained or, facilitated for your team.
Yeah. I think the other thing it really highlighted for me was, while like Docker Hub is very well known, especially the brand of it's well known, it really does sort of highlight the importance of the old saying, sort of own your deps, own your dependencies, make sure you know where your content's coming from, and probably more than anything else, it kind of reinforces the idea that while certain things can be really simple to download from the internet,
True.
there needs to be a little more cooperation going on between the teams within your organization that own the security or are responsible for security, responsible for registry, and the developers who kind of just want to get things done, because the simplicity and the frictionless doesn't come without the potential of security risk, and I think your numbers sort of highlight that.
I also wonder how much awareness there is that there is no scanning on Docker Hub and other sources of images. That if you find that people think that, well, it's on Docker Hub, it must be good to use, and is there a strong awareness that people should be doing their own security?
It's a good question. I think we'll probably have that for the next maybe report. So we didn't ask that specifically, but in general. I very much relate to this concern, because I think if you even had some kind of a badge or a very simple UI thing that would tell this image just chips with 50 vulnerabilities or generally it's vulnerabilities free, at least from what we scanned, what is known or something like that. That would be, I think, a good metric to raise awareness as well, because I think people, if they would see kind of a red flag saying this has X amount of vulnerabilities, they might think twice, or at the very least, I think they would be less lazy to say, well, maybe I can find something a little bit better and just maybe pick and choose, a different tag. And, it's just, I think what Brian said before, maybe also like a little bit more awareness raising than, trying to generally fix the problem, for the entire ecosystem around open source software or Docker images or whatever. So yeah, I think that's a good point, and we should try and emphasize that more.
If you go back to the first one, you said something about 78% of the vulnerabilities are found in indirect dependency. I wonder how much overlap that is. Like if you have a way of telling, like are a large amount of them the same vulnerability that's just sucked into the code of like all the npm or the PyPy packages? Do you have a way to tease out when there's one maybe sticky culprit for a lot of these indirect dependencies?
Right. So it's a good question, and I think that what this graph is also trying to show is that ecosystems kind of have a different way of of how they work. So what you can see is in Python and in PHP in general, there's a lot of use of direct dependencies and not a lot, or at least from what we find, there's a lot of vulnerabilities that we find in direct dependencies rather than indirect. Where this is kind of different for the other ecosystems. NPM is obviously, I think, the best example of reusing other people's code, whether that library has a single line of code to do something. So there is a lot of indirect dependencies there, and whether that dependency is, as you said, multiply used around different projects, or, just accumulating to kind of being the one that is properly used. I think it will happen mostly in either in ecosystems that are very big like NPM, yet have a very specific set of modules that are kind of the most popular ones and drive, the entire ecosystem. So you could find in NPM modules like, debug or express or something like that. Well, Express maybe not be a good example here because that's usually a direct dependency, but where you would have stuff like colors or debug or other or streams management or stuff like that, these would get billions of downloads. And generally speaking, we might find that in many projects and snapshots that we scanned. But again, these are the building blocks of those communities regardless, or of these ecosystems regardless. So maybe I'll go and jump into the maintainer's point of view, which is I relate a lot to this as well, as I maintain some open source packages and projects myself. And when we ask developers, well, are you a maintainer? And we want to ask you some questions around it. Is one of the things that I think there's a good and bad here, right? Or a positive and less positive thing here. So open source maintainers, kind of, when we ask them what is your security knowledge, when we gave them, there's a ranking, and we assimilated that into, of course, aggregated that into kind of low, medium, and high at the end of it, is on average 6.6 out of those 10 said, they have a high enough. Not high enough, just an average of 6.6 out of 10 knowledge in security. And, this is the good part of that. The positive side is when we asked and did this report last year, the numbers improved, right? So according to last year, only 17% said that they had a high level of security knowledge. And, this year you can see the numbers, they're like 30%. So I think this is a good shift in terms of people are a little bit more aware on security topics and concerns. And I think this is what kind of made them, because this is, of course, a perceived number. It's kind of, what do I think that, I know about security kind of thing if I had to answer this survey. So it's not a very, very detailed of, I asked you several questions around it as well. And then based on that, I would accumulate it. So it's kind of a perceived number, which is good enough, right? Because we would want to think that people are kind of trying to reflect the actual state of what they are in. It's, of course, an anonymous and survey as well. The other positive thing is that I think correlate with that statement of mine is the amount of people that rated their knowledge as low has also decreased, meaning, last year more people, 26% of them said that they had, a low security expertise, but this year it's just 7, right? So in general, I think it kind of, people are kind of I think I noticed that in the numbers, they're kind of more to the middle and a little bit more to those that think that they have high expertise. And the thing is, if we take these numbers and go and say, well, those people, those maintainers, developers, that they have a high expertise of, or some average of 6.6, which is it is an average, out of those that we asked, and well, when you do code auditing to your code base, how often do you do that? So 1 in 4, as we're seeing here, 26% of them, the green bar here in the pie chart is saying they don't even do any code auditing at all. So I'm saying there's a little bit of contrast between people perceiving themselves as generally having high expertise, and 7 maybe have low, but still there's a practice of just security testing that developers or maintainers specifically don't do. And I know, Brian, from your perspective, are you seeing developers or maintainers generally, like how do they get DevSecOps or in general, adding security very early in the process? Is it something that you're seeing a lot when talking to developers, or is it something that they still think or perceive as something that's not yet shifted left enough for them to take ownership?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the group. I think if the group that's developing the application gets security involved or has security as a focus sort of early in their process of building an application or even just forming the group, then it tends to be kind of a natural function that's in there. I think when it's something that they sort of evolve out of an existing set of sort of IT groups or IT silos, it's difficult for them to sort of shift security back left into their processes. They still think of it as something that gets looked at after builds get done, or maybe the step before things get deployed into production. But yeah, I think it's harder for companies, and again, I think it gets looked at sometimes as a friction point of including security. I think the good news is the more and more sort of data like this comes out, and unfortunately, the more and more we have these sort of huge vulnerabilities and attacks and
happening
break-ins
in the wild,
and stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, it has to. It's going to become something that
awareness.
just sort of has to happen, right? But yeah, I mean, I think the good news is, you're seeing more and more here that says developers would like to do that. They would like to have the ability to do that. And I think some of it's, them proving to some of the security teams that they're capable of doing it, because it wasn't necessarily their responsibility before, or security teams felt like, that was our job. Don't worry about it. You guys aren't as clued into the bad things that are out there. So, a lot of it's awareness. It's just, continue awareness, continue what's going on, and then, the responsibility of folks like us as vendors to make the tools more embedded in what they do, day to day, whether it's CI builds, IDE tools, the platforms themselves, all that sort of stuff.
Yep, I completely agree. I think that there's a good level of awareness happening out of those incidents, and security is just one concern that teams have. It's before I drill into it, I just wanted to. So security is kind of this cross-cutting concern that teams have, and they need to deal with at some point, right? And hopefully very early in the process, so it's not an afterthought, and it's not another Equifax that happens. And I like the fact that 81% think they should own security. I think that's generally a good notion of something that would drive adoption of security tools or generally security best practices into teams very easily, because they have a very good feeling around ownership around this area. It's not something that I think if we would ask that, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, they would say, there's a security team, there's a security guy or girl, and they will take care of that. So it's not there, and I think that's a really positive part of it. And this is where I want to go into. So we have developers kind of, I think we're just hitting it because I'm scrolling really fast on this. Sorry. There we go. So the security lifecycle, right? And this is where I want to actually connect it with developers. So these are the stats for developers when we asked about, do you embed security testing? And I said before, 37 developers, don't do any automated security testing. That's just one stats out of others as well. So only 14% of them test for example, for known vulnerabilities in their container images. And others, whether they do checks for open source dependencies or whether they do statistically static tests for their open source dependencies as well, or their own codes actually. All of that is kind of, I think, like I said before, kind of scraping the DevSecOps part of shifting left security. So this is how developers would find out, right? Of developers, this is how it would surface into their team, and they could own that that security aspect. And if it's an open source library, they would maybe upgrade it or find a fix for that. If it's just static code analysis that they're running some tool for, which is great, they would be able to say, in CI, in a PR, for example, before this goes into production or anything else or some testing branch, they could say, block that PR. I found something failing. Or amazingly enough, if they would have even something that would like an OWASP Z attack proxy, like the OWASP ZAP project, to kind of pen test it while you're running the CI test. So alongside with your unit tests, alongside with your integration tests, maybe with your system tests as well, maybe you try to security pen test it in a kind of automated way, right? It's not the exact, hacker-driven manual workflow to kind of exploit it, but it's still good enough. So we have also, I think, very different levels of kind of DevSecOps adoption, right? And it's a natural thing that people would start with, I think, easy wins, and what are things that would go really well with their development processes. And as they scale that up, they would add more and more scope around their security testing, so it would evolve. So just as you maybe start with unit testing, then you would add more and more different layers of testing. Kind of security testing is kind of the same. And I wanted to get here just to the point of what you said before about security teams and IT teams and stuff like that. And I think that I don't think that you would replace a security person or a team in an organization, right? I think it would be more about instead of security people, chasing maybe developers and let's do this, let's update that library, let's look at what's going on. Instead of doing that, they would do more of a mentoring, of a coaching, of I think a very high level of empowering developers, who would want to fix something, and they could work with them on threat models and why does a security breach can happen and why not. And it would be more of an educational and empowering process that security expertise would have, instead of usually just trying to run some tools or chase teams to get that high in priority and stuff like that. So I think that's an aspect that's an aspect of the report as well that's kind of in between the lines is maybe happening.
So Liran, I have a quick question on that last side too, and it's about sort of how you're defining who the developer is. Because there's the probably the large majority of your customers are, I would suspect, are enterprises and folks that are using Snyk and having some security team. But there's also a lot of the open source projects, so the people who are actually building the Python libraries or the Kubernetes modules or whatever it is. And is there any distinction because I have a suspect, and I don't know for sure, that people who are working on an open source initiative, a well-developed project like Kubernetes has some of the security built into the testing and release cycle and process, but some of the other projects might not have that. And that's the distinction between an enterprise developer and someone who's actually working on an open source project. Was there a difference in the awareness or the sense of responsibility for the security and the scanning that you see?
So we ask developers in general. We haven't, kind of tried to put that into specific organizations levels. And this was an open source security report. So in general, this kind of tried to ask around developers, both in their workplaces, obviously, because we use open source libraries, and that's kind of part of the report. But I think I understand what you're trying, I think, to get at, and I think in general, developers have this awareness of security. I think we're seeing it more and more. I'm on the security working group, and I'm seeing a lot of people just chiming in and unrelated even to Node, and trying to figure out how would they fix something, or maintainers in open source projects that would get a security report to their repo, to their issue queue, maybe something, or maybe this would just some CVE that got flagged for a team that would open an issue for that maintainer, and they would jump into our repo and say, well, why did it happen? Explain, etc. Let's work this out. So I think in general, this kind of, I think this slide is what you meant, is kind of reflecting the ownership around security. And I think more on that is if you go and look at open source projects on GitHub, for example, you would see that many of them try to embrace that badge, that badge that says on the README, vulnerabilities count X, and hopefully that would be 0, and it would be a green badge. So that's kind of think of a way to kind of gamify the whole experience, of course, for maintainers and developers. But that's a very strong between the lines statement of the ownership and the communication of the commitment to security that maintainers want to have, right? And this is something that I think is I'm seeing more and more of these badges. These are stuff that we're trying to evangelize in my hat under a Snyk employee, as well as the Node Foundation, to try and get this awareness out as much as we can, and have kind of a security commitment that the project owner would put out there. And this really ties a lot to what we said at the beginning. If we had seen kind of a red or green flag on a Docker Hub project page that says it has X vulnerabilities or it's free of them, it just by having that statistics without anything else, that would raise awareness towards people consuming that. And again, all of this kind of ties into that same ecosystem where Brian said that before as well, that this is about awareness, and just having this notion is key to just driving DevSecOps left, or generally just owning security much stronger within the teams. So I don't know if we have questions in the chat. I'm going to check that for a second. All right, no questions yet. So if we move to find out how do developers find out about vulnerabilities, and just think about it for a second. There's a good percent, the 27% number here of developers who are not finding out about vulnerabilities at all. They have no proactive / automated / whatever kind of way that they have stated to track vulnerabilities. And I think that again, this is something that we need to figure out. Why do developers don't have these tools? If they want to own ownership, what's the gap there? And how we can make that better? Because at the very least, we want to make sure that developers find out about vulnerabilities before it's too late. That's kind of reflecting the Equifax story more or less. At least finding out about the vulnerability, then taking action into remediating it, patching, upgrading, whatever that needs. But at least find out and then do something about it. So that's something that we need to figure out how to do. I guess at the good side of that is the 36% where users do use some kind of a dependency management or scanning tool that tells them how to or what vulnerabilities are there, and hopefully how to fix and remediate them. Here is something that is, I think, very common in some ecosystems. We took this stat from Python, but I don't think that's a very specific case to Python indeed. So what we try to figure out here is, assuming a vulnerability was found in an open source dependency that you use, how long would it take developers in general who use this dependency to move to a newer or upgrade to a newer fixed version? So I looked specifically at the WebSockets package to PyPy. By 2018 August, so around 6 months ago or something a little bit more than that, there was a vulnerability that was disclosed. There was a fix for it, and from that point in time, you can see that 6 months later, until the end of my last sample for that for the download for that specific library, I could see that there are more than hundreds, right? We're talking about thousands, and maybe a spike of tens of thousands somewhere of downloads of a vulnerable library that there's generally either no reason or no excuse to use that vulnerable library, or I could assume that maybe these are legacy apps, or some kind of maintenance problems where they couldn't use a newer version because maybe it would break APIs or something like that, which is not really mostly the case with security fixes, because usually a security fix is trying to to remediate the problem without adding or breaking other APIs at all, so that users can adopt it actually. But this, I think, when looking at this, it kind of shows this long tail of users wanting, or in general, they have this good sense of ownership for security and wanting to stay, up to date with security. But the reality of the matter is, when you look at something like this, is a lot of users are staying vulnerable in their apps, whatever that is, just because they're not upgrading. So it's kind of related to the story that we had before, Brian, with Docker images, and just having to rebuild or swap an image tag, and just having that sense of information where they don't know about. 27% of them they don't know about these vulnerabilities is a first step of having that knowledge to take some kind of action about it, at the very least. So when we look at developers finding out about vulnerabilities, or maybe not so much finding out about vulnerabilities, and we try and figure out, well, how do maintainers find out about vulnerabilities? Because that's kind of important enough. That's kind of the other perspective of it. And there's a good amount of people who are only maintainers, right? Who are only learning about a vulnerability in their code, in their repository, when someone is opening a public issue, which is, if you think about it for a second, it's also an interesting statistics if you take that and then remember that there were 30% of developers who said, we have a good or a high, not even a good, right? A good is kind of an average thing, but they have a high level of security expertise. Yet, almost half of them, they only learn of some vulnerabilities when a public issue is opened into their repository, which means they didn't find out about it. Maybe that was someone else.
This to me was maybe one of the most surprising things for me in the report. And has this changed over time from the last year, or is this pretty much steady on from last year's report?
I'm not sure that we asked that one specifically last time, so I don't have an answer on that one specific. But I would want to see. In general, I think that I'm not really sure, or let me rephrase that. I'm not really sure that the statistics of 72% of users find out about vulnerabilities when they review their own code. I think that's kind of one of those cases where it's perceived. It's kind of a false positive, a perceived expertise that you may have. I'm not really sure that this kind of holds. And I would probably see I would probably see something like an improvement for if we had done this, if we would do this report in the next year, it would be something like they would find more about vulnerabilities, when some audit happens in their CI, etc. As I think we will see more tools and more developers in general helping users to adopt security very early in their processes, which is what I like about Snyk doing that in a very unobtrusive way, in a very seemingly process for developers. So as I think that we will see that emerging, we will also see, generally this bar going down, and maybe people are not, informing you about a vulnerability before because you would find it much before someone would open it. And this also kind of depends on how we're looking at which vulnerabilities are we finding. Is it someone opening an issue about, specific, code that you wrote versus whether, you're just using a library, that is vulnerable and you only need to do to upgrade it, which is a common practice of what happens in the NPM and Node ecosystem, for example. So we're seeing a lot of those because of the amount of indirect dependencies that we have. And there's a good statistics on what I mentioned at the first when we reviewed the dashboard is assuming that a vulnerability was added by myself to my source code when I first programmed this library. I added that in day one. So how long does it take until someone finds this vulnerability, right? And then there's a fix for it, there's a disclosure for it. So the median time is over 2 years. The most, the quickest time to fix that I could find was 289 days. It's almost a year. So that's a long time for a vulnerability to surface, which is why I think also, these statistics of 72% of users finding out when they review their code is a little bit of a perceived, a false positive perceived of expertise that developers have. But it's good, that I think that we're saying that they want to take this ownership and they perceive themselves, even if there's like a slight, bias there, that they feel about themselves is still, I think, a strong movement into ownership of security for developers.
So, we're almost towards the end of the hour here, and I'm wondering
Yep.
for you, Liran, what was the most surprising finding or a thing that jumped out at you from this report and doing this research?
So I think for me, the Docker stats were surprising a bit, basically because I could really relate to them from being a developer before and having this my own Docker file and stuff like that, and I didn't really pay attention in my early days for these things. And I don't know if to say surprising, but I really like the 81% stats of developers being responsible for their security. I was happy to see that. Happy to see that people or developers want to embrace security for themselves.
I think that's a good trend, and as we give them more tools, more skills and understanding of this, we won't be discovering TVs via Twitter anymore. So there's been
I hope so.
If you want to jump over there and just was asking a question. Do you look for vulnerabilities continuously, or do you use any ML techniques to find them proactively? And I think she's referring to what you do at Snyk.
Yeah, so another good question. So we do both. So obviously, we work with, we connect and we work with public CVEs. We have that as well as in our database. But there is a good amount of using something that we call, kind of a threat intelligence, that we kind of use specific techniques to follow vulnerabilities before they get public, before they maybe even get triaged and fixed very quickly in the process, so that we catch those really fast. There's some good statistics in the report. I think when we pull that out, so there's I think more, but in the dashboard at least what we took out to highlight is those public databases that have their, they only account for 60% of vulnerabilities that we track, meaning we generally have, much more vulnerabilities that we're able to tell you that you would not find they haven't yet, been triaged or haven't been surfaced into something like a public CVE database. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. I think we have to wrap up here. Brian, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, no,
Awesome.
there's so much in this report. I think I have about 3 pages of notes. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but yeah, no, for anybody, definitely dig into it. There's a ton in there, everything from how to deal with the OS to how teams are organized to some really good stats to take up to your executives about why you should be putting more effort and money into this stuff. So congratulations on the report. Really enjoyed it.
And how can they get a hold of you, Liran, if they have more questions there?
Awesome. So I pasted in the chat the information to get into the report itself if you want directly to get a PDF, as well as if you want to get into the blog post, which kind of curates some parts of that into the specific key takeaways. If you want to get a hold of me, I'm Liran_Tal on Twitter. I'll be happy to chat with you and, see how we can improve together the open source security. So the next state of open source security report would be even better.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Liran, for taking the time today.